Good morning, atheists, agnostics, skeptics, free thinkers, whatever you like to call yourself. You are welcome here. At Seattle Atheist Church, we call ourselves an atheist church because you will never hear anything supernatural promoted from the podium. Last week, we had a talk about a woman named Esther Hicks. So let me remind you just for a moment about that talk. So Esther Hicks believes that she channels 100 disembodied spirits. And she believes that we create reality with our minds. We can cure any illness in just a moment by believing that it is cured, and that medicine only works because we believe it does. Okay? There's no difference between science-based medicine and witch doctors. Now, one of her followers asked her, what about small children who are born with disabilities or born into terrible situations, terrible poverty? And she replied that there is no such thing as a small child. That these small children, what we think of as small children, are really just ancient spirits who have chosen to come in and have this experience. It's only your judgment that you think that there's a problem with whatever it is that they're experiencing. Okay, when I was writing about that, even just reflecting on it again, I could get myself really worked up, and I could see on the faces of people's here some sort of grimaces. That superstitious nonsense is precisely the contrast with today's talk. This woman her name is Esther Duflo. So another Esther, and Duflo is an economics professor at MIT. She's one of the co-founders of the Abdul Latif Jameel Poverty Action Lab with Abhijit Banerjee, who's her co-author, and that's JPAL for short. They have a whole network of professors which work to figure out what are the real causes of global poverty and which initiatives really make a difference. And they are looking to support governments in making policy decisions which are basically based on evidence. So Banerjee, for example, consults with the World Bank and with the government of India. They both won tons of awards and fellowships, and Duflo won the MacArthur Genius Fellowship in 2009. Okay, and what I didn't realize was that this book actually has its own website, which is just pooreconomics.com if you're interested in that. So in the last 50 years, we have made amazing progress on global poverty. So if you think about people in third world countries, you might have called to mind an image of people who are starving. You might think about we need to get them grain. But today, most people, even in third world countries, do have enough food to keep from starving. And sometimes natural disasters or distribution problems can cause temporary food shortages, but fewer people today are starving because we just can't produce enough food. The struggle today is to get micronutrients to people to actually cause health, right? To create health. And the benefits of getting micronutrients into the diet of prenatal, of women who are of childbearing age, and then of young children, it not only causes those children to be healthy, but it actually carries forward multiple generations. That how healthy my children are is correlated with how healthy my own mother was. So we're focused on improving the nutritional quality of food, allowing people to not only survive, but to thrive. And it turns out that it costs very little to get prenatal vitamins to mothers. It costs very little to mix a packet of prenatal nutritional supplement into the food of preschoolers, or to fortify fish sauce with iron, or to fortify salt with iodine. And very low cost measures are radically changing the quality of people's lives. So giving vaccinations and anti-malarial and deworming medicines to small children can allow them to be healthier, to stay in school, to get better educated, and this affects the quality of their life for the rest of their lives. Now, part of the premise of the book Poor Economics is that depending on your political point of view, it's going to affect what you think should be happening. And so there are people who, like Jeffrey Sachs, who's written The End of Poverty, who he believes that the environment is a huge factor in why there is so much poverty in places like India and Africa. And he believes that the poor need a push to escape the cycle of poverty. So the cycle goes something like this. You know, if you're very hungry, you might be listless, and then it's difficult to work to grow the food. If you have a lack of education in childhood, it affects lifetime earning, and then you can't afford to send your child to school. A lack of medical care might lead preventative medical care, then causes somebody to get sick, where they end up having to pay a lot of money, and so often what they'll do is they'll take out a loan to pay for the medical care at that point, which now puts them into terrible debt. And there's even a lack of infrastructure, such as banks, that are willing to open accounts for the very poor, because it costs something just to even take care of a loan. So if you're living on less than $1 a day, then a bank might not even be willing to give you a savings account, let alone like those of us who have work jobs where we have automatic deduction plans into retirement and things like that. So the idea is that governments can give a little jump start, which would have huge benefits. Now, on the other hand, and because we're an atheist church, we're not about telling people what to think so much as we're interested in just how to think. And so we want to engage in critical thinking and hear both sides of a story, perhaps, and try to think critically about it. On the other hand, we have people like Dambisa Moyo, who's the author of the book Dead Aid, who writes about the fact that a lot of the aid that comes from other countries comes into countries, she believes leads to waste and corruption and even undermining local people to come up with solutions for themselves. So we, depending on what your political point of view is, it's going to affect what your policy recommendations are. Now, the point that the foundation that Banerjee and Duflo have founded is to go in and to design experiments and then collect evidence to come up with evidence-based solutions to see what really works. So let's see. What actually happens when we give people things, or allow them to buy them at different price points, or have an incentive campaign for doing certain actions that the government believes will be beneficial? Whether it's immunizing your children, sending them to school, if we have an education campaign about something like using condoms, what actually happens? And then they design experiments together with a whole network of professors, and they replicate the study in dozens of villages and indeed in dozens of developing nations to see which of their assumptions proved out to be true, or did they get surprising results. And it teaches us, at very least, it also teaches us things about human nature. So why would people who are very close to the starving line buy a television instead of more food? Why would they buy sugar instead of vegetables? And, when they go in and they interview people, it's, of course, mental stimulation from the television is very important. And often the reason people will buy sugar for tea is because having people over and offering them a cup of tea is worth more to them than having some more vegetables in their diet. And then if you think about, I was sort of talking about this and, oh, isn't this or that surprising? And of course, if you think about what we do here in the United States, where we have all of this affluence and all of this information, do we get our full, 7 to 9 servings of vegetables a day, or do we, use our extra income to buy kind of luxuries? So the idea here is to figure out what actually works and then design experiments which give people a nudge in the right direction. And there's a whole science of the nudge, right? And we want to raise awareness of that. And in fact, there's a whole book called Nudge, which I think it might be interesting if somebody else, or me, whoever, that if we read that book and then we could talk about nudge. So some examples from this book. So we talked about effective altruism when we talked about the importance of bed nets and how for very little money, bed nets can protect families against getting malaria. So one of the experiments that they did is, well, if we give people the bed nets, one political point of view might be if you give them the bed nets, they don't value the nets. Or they're going to take the nets, and there's tales of people using the nets for bridal veils or fishing or doing other things with the nets. But one of the studies that so when I say a study they did, realize that they replicate the study in a lot of different villages and even in different countries. So from Kenya to Brazil, to Sao Paulo, Brazil. And what they found out was that when they offered the bed nets at very, very affordable prices or gave them away for free, not only did people use them, some percentage of people didn't use them. When the researchers came back and asked them, like, are you using the nets? If the people hadn't been using the nets, then they started using them. But the people who had bed nets were more likely to buy more bed nets in the future. And friends and family members, extended family members of the people who had bed nets were likely to come back later and buy the bed nets. It's not like getting a subsidized bed net made people now think, well, I should always get my bed net for free. It was just mostly people just weren't used to using the bed nets, and then after they got the bed nets, they started to understand that a bed should have a bed net, Another study that they did had to do with making sure that people had clean water, because there's a huge problem with children dying from diarrhea. And the thing about the diarrhea is that even once a child gets diarrhea, the diarrhea can be helped greatly by drinking a solution of like salt and sugar. But what they found out in these villages is that the parents, even when they were offered the salt and sugar water, they wanted something that would be injectable because they had the belief that the medicine had to go into the bloodstream. Or they wanted antibiotics. And then there's a huge problem in third world countries with people getting antibiotics for things they don't need antibiotics for, not using all of the antibiotic, developing antibiotic resistant malaria. And so that's a whole problem that they're also trying to avoid. But that the water could be treated with just 18 cents worth of Clorox. Chlorine they call it, and it's basically bleach. And so trying to get people to use the bleach. But another thing that they can do is have plumbing where the water comes chlorinated. And it used to cost about $20 per household. They have the price of that down to $4 a household now. And there's a group called Graham Vickas, which goes in and puts in plumbing. And what they do is there was a problem initially that uppercase families didn't want to share water supply with lowercase families. But they made a policy that said, well, everyone in the whole village has to have the plumbing before we will turn this water supply on. And so now they're, it's really working great that they're getting the water is coming in chlorinated, because for whatever reason, even at 18 cents to clean your water for the whole week, people would often not clean the water. And so we have to bring in the plumbed in water. And then finally, they look at things like there's a millennium goal that every person under 8th grade or up until 8th grade should have a free schooling. And then now they go in and they've done amazing things, like in terms of like tripling the amount of children who now have access to a school. But they are criticizing this because access to a school, does that necessarily translate into learning? And so what exactly do we want them to learn, and measuring learning? And when they come in and they measure what the kids know, unfortunately, often the kids are way behind what they would expect the kids to be. And they start looking at why. And they think that there's something that culturally in colonial times, there was an idea of taking your brightest kids, finding the brightest people, and then training them to become administrators or whatever for the empire. And so there's still this idea, we send the smart kid and then the other kids don't get to go, or somehow receive the message from the family. Even when there are two pretty smart kids, the smarter child will receive a lot of support for school, and then the other child will be like kept home or discouraged or whatever. And so they're trying to change that. But now at least there are schools, and they are finding what really works. And so some policies, like we have all this curriculum, we just need to make sure that the state has said to receive the money you have to cover all this curriculum, but they find that, for example, it is better when you identify kids who are behind, instead of making sure they cover a certain amount of curriculum, that we take them aside and we give them remedial education, make sure they can read, make sure they can do basic math, and then they are able to realize these gains after they get that support. But the whole idea is to design experiments and see what actually works, as opposed to just making decisions that, from your political point of view. So I think it sounds awesome, and it's not only is this good for the all over the world, it's a great practice to do here in the United States as well. And so I will close the way I always do, which is atheists believe in good because good works in non-mysterious ways. Thank you.